The American Indian removal refers to a dark and controversial chapter in United States history, where Native American tribes were forcibly displaced from their ancestral lands. This process primarily took place during the 19th century and was driven by the expanding desires of European American settlers and the U.S. government to access and utilize the lands occupied by these tribes. To remove a people means more than just physical displacement. It entails stripping them of their homeland, which holds immense cultural, spiritual, and historical significance. For many Native American tribes, the land was intertwined with their identity, traditions, and way of life. It was the foundation of their society, providing the resources necessary for survival and the basis for their cultural practices and social structures. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, was a legislative measure that authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi River to lands west of the river. This act led to the infamous Trail of Tears, a series of forced relocations that resulted in the suffering and death of thousands of Native Americans. The journey was arduous, with inadequate supplies, harsh weather, and exposure to diseases, leading to high mortality rates. The impact of the removal went beyond the immediate loss of life and land. It disrupted the social fabric of Native American communities, severing ties to places that were integral to their cultural heritage. The forced migrations also led to long-term socio-economic challenges, as displaced tribes struggled to adapt to new and unfamiliar environments, often less fertile and more hostile than their original homelands. Additionally, removing a people entails a form of cultural erasure. The displacement efforts sought to assimilate Native Americans into Euro-American society, undermining their languages, traditions, and governance structures. This was further perpetuated through policies that targeted Native American children, placing them in boarding schools designed to strip away their cultural identities and replace them with Western norms and values. In essence, the removal of Native American tribes was not just a physical displacement but an attempt to erase their existence and assimilate them into a dominant culture. It was a process that inflicted deep psychological and cultural scars, the repercussions of which are still felt today. The forced relocations and the policies that accompanied them serve as a stark reminder of the injustices faced by indigenous populations and the enduring need for reconciliation and respect for their rights and heritage. The Muscogee Nation, also known as the Creek Nation, faced a harrowing experience with removal that mirrors the broader tragedy of Native American displacement in the 19th century. Before their forced relocation, the Muscogee people inhabited a vast region in what are now the southeastern United States, particularly in present-day Georgia and Alabama. Their society was complex and well-organized, with a rich cultural heritage and established agricultural practices. The pressure for removal intensified with the signing of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Muscogee Nation, like many other tribes, faced immense pressure from European American settlers eager to acquire their fertile lands. Despite their efforts to coexist and adopt some aspects of European American culture, the Muscogee people were not spared from the government's removal policies. In 1832, the Treaty of Cusseta was signed, ostensibly allowing individual Muscogee people to retain their land if they registered with the government. However, this treaty was fraught with deceit and coercion. Land speculators and government agents often manipulated the process, resulting in the loss of Muscogee land and further eroding their autonomy. Many Muscogee were tricked into selling their lands or were forcibly removed regardless of the treaty's provisions. The removal process culminated in the late 1830s, when the Muscogee were forcibly marched to what is now Oklahoma. This journey, part of the broader Trail of Tears, was marked by extreme hardship. The Muscogee people endured treacherous conditions, including severe weather, inadequate supplies, and exposure to disease. The journey resulted in significant loss of life, with many Muscogee dying from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Upon arrival in the designated Indian Territory, the Muscogee faced the challenge of rebuilding their society in a new and unfamiliar land. The transition was not easy, as they had to adapt to different environmental conditions and continue dealing with external pressures and conflicts with other displaced tribes. Despite these challenges, the Muscogee people demonstrated resilience, gradually re-establishing their communities and preserving their cultural heritage. The removal had profound and lasting impacts on the Muscogee Nation. It disrupted their traditional way of life, severed their connection to ancestral lands, and inflicted deep psychological and cultural trauma. The forced relocation efforts exemplified the broader injustices faced by Native American tribes during this period, highlighting the devastating consequences of policies aimed at erasing indigenous identities and autonomy. In contemporary times, the Muscogee Nation continues to honor its heritage and history while navigating the ongoing challenges posed by their historical experiences with removal. The legacy of their forced displacement remains a crucial aspect of their collective memory and identity, serving as a testament to their endurance and strength in the face of adversity. The Cherokee Nation's resistance to removal is a poignant story of perseverance, legal strategy, and ultimately tragic displacement. Faced with increasing pressure from European American settlers and the U.S. government, the Cherokee Nation employed various methods to resist the encroachment on their lands and maintain their autonomy. One of the primary strategies the Cherokee used was legal resistance. Under the leadership of Principal Chief John Ross and other prominent figures, the Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution in 1827, modeled after the U.S. Constitution. This move was intended to demonstrate their capability to govern themselves and to assert their status as a sovereign nation. The Cherokee Nation took their legal resistance to the highest courts in the land. They engaged in a series of legal battles, the most notable being Worcester v. Georgia 1832. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, stating that they constituted a distinct community with self-governing rights and that the state of Georgia had no authority to impose its laws on Cherokee territory. Chief Justice John Marshall's decision affirmed the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation and was a significant legal victory. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling, President Andrew Jackson and the state of Georgia ignored the decision, continuing to push for the removal of the Cherokee people. The federal government negotiated the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 with a small faction of the Cherokee who did not represent the majority. This treaty ceded all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi River in exchange for land in the Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, and other compensations. John Ross and the majority of the Cherokee vehemently opposed the Treaty of New Echota, arguing that it was signed without the consent of the Cherokee National Council and was therefore illegitimate. Ross and his supporters petitioned the U.S. government, gathering thousands of signatures from Cherokee people protesting the treaty. However, their efforts were in vain as the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty by a single vote in 1836. Resistance continued in various forms, including appeals to the American public. The Cherokee Nation sought to garner support from sympathetic individuals and groups, including missionaries, politicians, and citizens who opposed the removal policy. They used newspapers, pamphlets, and public speeches to raise awareness about their plight and the injustices they faced. Despite their resistance, the forced removal, known as the Trail of Tears, began in 1838. Under the supervision of federal troops, thousands of Cherokee were forcibly marched to the Indian Territory. The journey was marked by severe hardships, including exposure to harsh weather, disease, and insufficient supplies, leading to the death of approximately 4,000 Cherokee people. The Cherokee Nation's resistance to removal is remembered as a testament to their determination to defend their rights and sovereignty. Their legal battles, appeals to public opinion, and efforts to assert their nationhood reflect a significant chapter in American history. Although the removal ultimately occurred, the resilience and spirit of the Cherokee people have endured, continuing to shape their identity and legacy today. Various Native American nations employed a range of strategies to avoid removal, reflecting their unique cultures, circumstances, and responses to increasing pressures from the U.S. government and settlers. Here are the experiences of 6 different Native nations. Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation utilized legal resistance and efforts to assimilate into European American society to demonstrate their ability to self-govern. They adopted a written constitution, created a bilingual newspaper, and engaged in legal battles, such as Worcester v. Georgia. Despite their efforts, the Treaty of New Echota, signed by a minority faction, led to the forced removal known as the Trail of Tears. Muscogee Creek Nation. The Muscogee attempted to resist removal through both negotiation and armed resistance. They signed treaties like the Treaty of Washington 1826, which ceded some lands but was intended to secure the rest. However, continuous pressure and fraudulent treaties, such as the Treaty of Cusseta 1832, led to displacement. Armed resistance, such as the Creek War of 1836, ultimately failed, resulting in forced relocation. Choctaw Nation. The Choctaw initially sought to negotiate with the U.S. government to retain some of their lands. They signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830, which was one of the first removal treaties. While some Choctaw leaders believed the treaty would allow part of the nation to remain, the terms were not honored, and the majority were forced west, suffering significant hardships during their relocation. Seminole Nation. The Seminole resisted removal through a combination of legal challenges, negotiation, and armed conflict. They signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing 1832 under duress, but many Seminole leaders refused to leave their Florida homeland. This resistance led to the Second Seminole War 1835 to 1842, a prolonged and costly conflict for the U.S. Despite fierce resistance, most Seminole were eventually relocated, although a small group remained in Florida. Chickasaw Nation. The Chickasaw sought to negotiate terms that would secure their future in the West. They signed the Treaty of Pontotoc Creek 1832, agreeing to cede their lands in Mississippi for lands west of the Mississippi River. Unlike other tribes, the Chickasaw negotiated for compensation to ensure their survival and transition to new lands. Their removal was somewhat less tragic compared to others, as they managed to secure resources for their relocation. Sac and Fox Nations. The Sac and Fox Nations employed both negotiation and armed resistance to avoid removal. Under leaders like Black Hawk, they resisted encroachments on their lands in Illinois and Wisconsin. The Black Hawk War 1832 was a direct result of their resistance to forced relocation. The conflict ended in defeat for the Sac and Fox, and they were eventually removed to lands west of the Mississippi River, suffering significant losses. Each of these nations faced unique challenges and employed a variety of strategies to resist removal, including legal action, negotiation, assimilation efforts, and armed resistance. Despite their efforts, the overwhelming pressure and policies of the U.S. government led to the forced displacement of many Native American tribes, resulting in widespread suffering and loss. Their stories of resistance remain a testament to their resilience and determination in the face of immense adversity. Reflecting on the removal of Native American nations reveals a profound narrative of resilience, injustice, and cultural loss. The forced displacement of these communities, often referred to as ethnic cleansing, was driven by the U.S. government's expansionist policies and the insatiable desire of European American settlers for land. This reflection not only brings to light the physical hardships endured by Native Americans but also the deep psychological and cultural scars that persist to this day. The removal processes, epitomized by events like the Trail of Tears, resulted in immense suffering. Thousands of Native Americans died from exposure, disease, and starvation during the arduous journeys to unfamiliar territories. Families were torn apart, communities disbanded, and ancestral lands, which held profound spiritual and cultural significance, were lost. These lands were more than just places to live, they were integral to the identities and traditions of Native American tribes. Despite the overwhelming adversities, Native American nations displayed remarkable resilience. They employed various strategies to resist removal, from legal battles and negotiations to armed resistance. The Cherokees' legal fight, culminating in Worcester v. Georgia, stands as a testament to their determination to assert their rights within the framework of U.S. law, even when the federal government ignored judicial rulings. Similarly, the Seminoles' fierce resistance in the Second Seminole War highlights their unwillingness to surrender their homeland without a fight. The removal also had profound cultural implications. It disrupted traditional ways of life, severed ties to sacred lands, and sought to erase indigenous identities through assimilation policies. The boarding schools that followed the removal era aimed to strip Native American children of their cultural heritage, furthering the cycle of cultural erosion initiated by displacement. Reflecting on these events underscores the need for recognition, reconciliation, and reparative justice. It calls for a deeper understanding of the historical injustices faced by Native American communities and their ongoing struggles. Acknowledging this dark chapter in American history is essential for fostering a more inclusive and honest narrative about the nation's past. Today, many Native American communities continue to fight for their rights, land, and cultural preservation. Their enduring resilience is a powerful reminder of their strength and an inspiration for future generations. Efforts to revitalize languages, traditions, and governance structures are crucial for healing and empowerment. The reflection on removal is not just about looking back at a tragic past but also about recognizing the enduring spirit of Native American nations. It is about understanding their contributions, honoring their heritage, and committing to a future where their rights and cultures are respected and celebrated. This reflection is a step towards building a more equitable and just society that acknowledges and learns from the mistakes of its past. Removal in contemporary contexts can manifest in various forms, often less overt than the forced displacements of the 19th century but still deeply impactful. These modern forms of removal continue to disrupt the lives and cultures of indigenous and marginalized communities. They include environmental displacement, legal and economic pressures, cultural assimilation policies, and institutional discrimination. Environmental displacement remains a significant issue. Large-scale projects like pipelines, dams, and mining operations frequently encroach on indigenous lands. These projects often proceed without adequate consultation or consent from the affected communities, leading to loss of land, destruction of sacred sites, and environmental degradation. For instance, the construction of pipelines like the Dakota Access Pipeline has sparked significant protests from Native American tribes due to threats to their water sources and ancestral lands. Legal and economic pressures also play a role in modern-day removal. Governments and corporations may use legal maneuvers to claim land or resources traditionally owned by indigenous communities. This can include eminent domain, where governments seize private land for public use, often offering inadequate compensation. Additionally, economic pressures such as poverty and lack of opportunities can force indigenous people to migrate from their homelands to urban areas, seeking better livelihoods but often facing discrimination and loss of cultural ties. Cultural assimilation policies, though less explicit than in the past, continue to undermine indigenous identities. Education systems that fail to incorporate indigenous histories, languages, and perspectives contribute to the erosion of cultural heritage. Moreover, social and political pressures to conform to mainstream cultural norms can lead to the gradual loss of traditional practices and languages. This form of removal erodes the cultural fabric of communities over time, making it challenging to preserve and pass down traditions. Institutional discrimination and marginalization further contribute to contemporary forms of removal. Indigenous and marginalized communities often face systemic barriers to accessing healthcare, education, and political representation. These barriers can lead to disenfranchisement and social exclusion, pushing individuals and communities to the fringes of society. The resulting displacement, whether physical or cultural, perpetuates cycles of poverty and disadvantage. Moreover, climate change poses a new and urgent threat. Rising sea levels, changing weather patterns, and extreme weather events disproportionately affect indigenous communities, many of whom live in vulnerable areas. For example, coastal and island communities are at risk of losing their homes entirely, prompting forced migration and the loss of cultural heritage tied to specific landscapes. Despite these challenges, indigenous communities continue to resist and assert their rights. Movements advocating for land rights, environmental justice, and cultural preservation are gaining momentum globally. Legal victories, such as land reclamations and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty, provide hope and highlight the resilience and agency of these communities. Reflecting on what removal looks like today underscores the ongoing struggles for justice and equality. It calls for greater awareness and action to address the systemic issues that perpetuate displacement and cultural erosion. Supporting indigenous rights, honoring treaties, and promoting inclusive policies are crucial steps toward a future where the dignity and heritage of all communities are respected and preserved.